Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's lovely to see you all here, and I just mentioned Alan Bringsbottom. He's just recently passed away. He was a popular attender to these little groups, so I've acknowledged him and just given you a whakatauki about the baskets. Combining baskets increases all of our knowledge. Few little housekeeping things. Please remember to turn off your phone. If you're needing to exit due to an alarm, we have an exit door out here. We go out here and head around into the gardens and assemble under the archway. If you're needing the toilets, men's, right hand side, women's, unfortunately halfway down the hall on the left. And I think that's all the housekeeping. To introduce our guest speaker, did a little bit of research. I've dug out some of her past history. It's looking like a This Is Your Life set of books. And to that I am amazed, because as someone who has started 2 books and has never finished them in many years, I am in awe of Alison's skills as a researcher, professor at Te Puna Wānanga, the School of Māori and Indigenous Education at the University of Auckland, and also an author. I don't know how she does it, but obviously does, and has won numerous awards and recognition for her efforts. And we are just so grateful to have Alison here to talk about Tuai. It's an amazing story, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about it. Alison does have some books, a small number of books available, so if you're wanting one, then you can see her after the talk, and there'll be a chance for questions afterwards as well. So now I'd just like to hand over to Alison and take us on a journey.
Tēnā koe Mac. I ngā tine hapū o te rohe nei, tēnā koutou. I ngā iwi o te haue whā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ka nui te mihi kia koutou, kua hui mai nei tēnei ata. It's lovely to see everybody here today. Thank you for coming to hear this interesting story. As Max says, my name's Alison Jones. I was born here in New Zealand, in Tamaki Makaurau. Would you rather I did this? Is that better? Yeah. Sorry. I was born in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, to immigrant parents from Britain. I'm a Pākehā. And as Max said, I'm a professor at the University of Auckland in the School of Māori and Indigenous Education. Now, people immediately say, well, what's a Pākehā doing in a School of Māori and Indigenous Education? And the reason I work in that particular school is because my most recent research work, writing, and practice is in the field of Māori Pākehā relations. So that's where I work and do my study and writing. And I noticed that Mac had done an archaeological dig in the library. You did miss one out, I have to say. Yes, it's an archaeological dig. But in the most recent, probably 20 years, I've focused on Māori Pākehā relations, both prior to the treaty in the north here, which are the 2 books here, Kōrero Words Between Us, which is a book about Māori engagement with pen and paper and interest in schools, and the Tuai story, which I'm going to talk to you about today, which is well before the treaty as well. And also my most recent book is This Pākehā Life, an Unsettled Memoir, which is really a sustained essay on Māori Pākehā relations in the last 70 years over my lifetime, told as a story through my own experiences and through my own eyes and all the hilarious and interesting experiences that I've had as a Pākehā growing up in a lot of small towns in New Zealand and ending up as an adult back in my birthplace of Auckland. So, as I said, I welcome you all today, and please don't hesitate if while I'm speaking you have a burning question. I'm very happy for you to just call out or to put your hand up or whatever you like to do, and also we will leave time at the end for questions. I like to talk about Tuai for a lot of reasons, because he's a young man who, I'll see if I can get this clicker to work. Whoops, do I have to go over this way? Ah yes, whoops. I know this is going to be the story of the day. He's a young man from the Bay of Islands, from the southeastern end of the Bay of Islands. And he had an astonishing life. He died in 1824, so well before the treaty, which is 1840, which is a time that many of us kind of bookmark, I think, for thinking about our history. But the story about him is not really just about him as an individual, although he is a very, very interesting man, but it's a story that reminds us about how the extent to which Māori from the north here were travelling overseas to England and to Australia well before the treaty, with political aims in mind. They were actively looking for a relationship with the Pākehā world, and in particular with the leaders of the people who had come here in some numbers from around about 1800. And so there was an active and thoughtful and strategic engagement by the Māori world, or by Māori hapu, with the rest of the world. And in the north here, it was very much about getting your own settler, or your own settlers. So different hapu, different rangatira would be travelling overseas to get their settlers from Australia or England particularly. I'm sure some went to America as well, but we don't really have records of them. But Tuai's life is illustrative of that hugely exploratory, curious, positive and confident engagement with the rest of the world that Tuai exhibited in his personality and his life. What was cool for me as a writer in writing this book was that it pretty much wrote itself, because I had encountered Tuai a number of times when I was writing here, Kōrero Words Between Us, with my colleague Kuni Kaa Jenkins, who's from Ngāti Porou. We kept coming across mentions of this man, Tui or Tuai, and Simon calls him Tui, I call him Tuai, maybe either. I kept coming across mentions of him in footnotes and in passing, and I thought, well, who is this person? He seems pretty important in terms of the things he's doing. So I just started to follow a few trails and found a remarkable amount written about him. In fact, he's the most written about Māori person, I would say, easily prior to 1840 and maybe after, even comparing with Hongihika. The amount of recording of his detailed recording of his thoughts is astonishing. So, okay, I'm not going to talk about his whakapapa. I'm just going to tell a bit of a touristy story of him because of, you as an audience today, I'm sure, are interested in that aspect. If you're more interested in the details, feel free to get the book out of the library or even buy a copy, but you'll be lucky if you can buy a copy because there's none left. My publisher just said they weren't publishing anymore, they didn't think. So I've got only 3 for sale, so if you get them, they're probably going to be worth millions and another great investment. So this is a painting of Tuai. This is the painting on the cover of the book, and it was painted in London in 1818. And you can see what a striking young man he was, and you can see probably from that picture, or you might not be able to see, but he's got a tāmoko, he's got a tattoo on one side of his face only, and it was common that young Māori men would get tattooed, but only on their faces, and women on their bodies, but only in bits, because it was extremely painful and difficult to heal from, and so he had half of his face tattooed by the time he went to England in 1818. Now let's see. I'm really sorry about that. I want to just locate us. I know we're all from the north here, and so you probably know where we're talking about. But here's the Bay of Islands. This is just off Google Maps. This is the main road north. There's Kiri. And the area that Tuai came from is this area, which is called Pāroa now, but he and his people really were from this whole area here, including some of these islands here. So this whole area here was Ngare Raumati at this time. And they were in conflict with the Ngāpuhi aligned tribes or hapu, really from this area. And there was another alliance of people from this more southern Waikari area. So one of the drivers, I think, in the story is the fact that Tuai and his brother Korokoro, his older brother or uncle, his older relation Korokoro, were very much seeking to get Pākehā to come into this part of the world in order to help bolster their strength in relation to their rivals who were from these northern tribal areas. And I've also pointed out there Rangihaua, which of course is where the first Pākehā settlement was in 1814, and that plays a little bit of a role, quite a big role in the story. So it just shows you kind of where we are on the map. I'm just going to take us a little bit further back to 1805, to this very important moment in our history. In 1805, Te Pahi, who was a Ngāpuhi aligned rangatira from that Rangihaua area in the north of the Bay of Islands, he travelled to Port Jackson, Poihākena or Sydney in 1805 with some of his sons. This is the short version of the story. In order to have a conversation with the governor there, the leader there, about the behaviour of Pākehā arriving in the Bay of Islands. Of course, the Bay of Islands, and many of you will know the story, was a very popular stopping off point from around about 1800 for whalers who were whaling in these waters right around New Zealand. And the Bay of Islands was a very popular stopping off point, and Te Pahi was a well-known rangatira from the north who was a very hospitable rangatira, and so people got to know about him and came in to the Bay of Islands regularly for fresh water, for rest, for fresh vegetables, and for the services of women. And so Te Pahi was pretty happy with this arrangement because it was benefiting him and his people. However, the behaviour of the whalers and the seamen was a lot to be desired, left a lot to be desired. They didn't obey or care to obey tikanga. They were getting involved in local fights, they were stealing things, they were kidnapping women and men, walking on tapu areas, etc. And so Te Pahi realised that he wanted this relationship with Pākehā, it was beneficial, but he needed them to be under control. And of course, if any of you know much about the treaty, here you hear the echoes of the desires of the treaty, the Māori desires of the treaty, which were that Pākehā could be here, but they must be under some kind of control.
if they're not going to be under Māori control, they've got to be under the control of their leaders. And so Te Pahi went to speak to the Governor, Philip Gidley King. He'd actually heard of Philip Gidley King before he went. That's a whole other story. But he ended up staying in Sydney for 3 months with Philip Gidley King, talking about really basically the situation in New Zealand for him and his people. As a result of this visit, or while he was there, he met Samuel Marsden. Most of you are familiar with that name, who was an evangelical Christian. He was the chaplain of the prison colony, the convict colony, a busybody, a businessman who made it his business to meet virtually anybody important coming off the wharves. He met Te Pahi. He was incredibly impressed with Te Pahi and his sons as being highly intelligent and interesting people, and decided, of course, as an evangelical Christian would, that the only thing Māori needed was Christianity, and they would be the perfect people in the world, and far surpassing the Irish, who were Catholics and whom he disliked intensely in Sydney. Anyway, so he said to Te Pahi, when you go back to your people, tell them they can come to live with me in Australia if they want to. They can come over whenever they want. I will accommodate them. And so he built on his farm at Parramatta, and you can, if any of you ever go to Sydney, I recommend you go to Parramatta up the river. Have any of you been to New Zealand Place in Parramatta? There's actually a place called Rangihu Park, which is named after this area where Māori lived from around about 1805, in this area that was part of Marsden's farm on the Parramatta River. He built that's a water wheel there, but he built accommodation for Māori visitors. Of course, he called it a seminary. He thought he could train young Māori to be Christian and come back and proselytise in New Zealand. He was completely unsuccessful in that, because Māori were saying, well, from his diaries we see that Māori were very interested that Pākehā, of course, had a god. I mean, who doesn't? And but were completely uninterested in the Pākehā god, because they said, well, he doesn't live in New Zealand and he doesn't know anything about us, and anyway we've got everything sorted. Thanks. So there were significant numbers of young men and some young women from the north travelled to Parramatta, got rides on ships or worked their passage or whatever they did to get there, and stayed in Sydney, accommodated by Marsden, and really learnt about Pākehā life, actually. Saw the factories, the schools, the farms. They rode horses, learned about sheep, wheat. In fact, one of these visitors brought wheat back to New Zealand in order to grow a wheat crop so that he could sell wheat back to Australia because of the droughts over there. There was an enormous amount of interest by Māori in travelling to Australia to look at Pākehā life there, and to study that society and its farming methods and so on. And one of the young men who was there asked Marsden if he would send a teacher to New Zealand to teach the children to read and write, not to New Zealand, to his hapu in the Northern Bay of Islands at Rangihaua, the Northern Bay of Islands. And of course Marsden was particularly delighted, as you could imagine, and he immediately said yes, and sent for a teacher, a pious teacher, who, he went to England actually, telling the short version, went to England, found a pious teacher whose name was Thomas Kendall. He came back to Australia with his family, his wife and 4 children I think they had at the time. And in Sydney, Thomas Kendall was being prepared to come to New Zealand to start the first school, in other words, to teach reading and writing. Because reading and writing was what was requested by Ruatara, who was the person who issued the invitation, according to Marsden. And he was to teach the children to read and write in Māori, course the Māori language was not written down, or it had been recorded by various other Pākehā, but Kendall had the job of transcribing Māori onto paper and forming a book in order to teach the children to read and write. Well, in order to do that, of course, he needed to be taught. To be taught Māori. Oh, I forgot about mentioning this young man here. But anyway, before I get to this man, he needed to be taught to speak Māori, to understand Māori, and to be able to transcribe it or write it onto paper. And Marsden asked Tuai, who happened also to be in Australia at the time, to live with the Kendalls and to teach Kendall how to speak Māori. And so Tuai assisted Kendall to write the first book. I've just flashed this guy up on the screen. His name's Titere, and he was another young visitor to Sydney at the time. And this was in about 1813. And he came from Rangihaua. So his people were rivals with Tuai's people, but that didn't really bother these young men. They were together in Sydney, probably having a good time like young men have in Sydney these days. And here's a picture, a painting of Sydney pretty much at that time, which is interesting because it shows Māori as well as the local Indigenous people and the settler people, the governor's house. It just shows that Māori were commonly present in Sydney, just as today, from this very early period. This is a picture I've also put up just to show you the appearance of Thomas Kendall. This is a painting of Thomas Kendall that is actually painted from life. You might be familiar with this image. It's quite a familiar image, really. And these two, this is Hongihika and this is Waikato, who later went to England. These are not painted from life, and you can kind of tell. They're pretty sort of general characteristics, but this one is painted from life. That's Kendall, sitting there with his Bible, and with an interesting look on his face. Okay, so as I said, Tuai happened to be in Sydney, and at this particular time, around about 1813, and he lived with the Kendall family and taught Kendall Māori and helped him write this first book. And this is a photograph of the front page of this book, Korau nor New Zealand, or the New Zealander's first book, being an attempt to compose some lessons for the instruction of the natives, Sydney, printed by George Howe in 1815. And some of you know what the spelling mistake is on the first school book? Yeah, this is meant to be koraro, which in those days was how you wrote kōrero, or words, or language. So he missed out, the printer missed out the R, so we have this weird word that means nothing in the title of our first school book. So it's a mixture of English and Māori, a language of New Zealand, etc. So this book, which is commonly known as Thomas Kendall's book, of course, is actually Tuai and Thomas Kendall's book. Something I object to, that Māori authors just disappear in the record. But here's a little bit, just a little sample of what the book looks like on the inside, with Māori here, English down this side, and you can see that Māori is, you can actually understand the Māori, but it's not standardised into the language as we see it today. You can see here haere atu rā, and clearly the northern dialect, that H at the beginning of haere is very, very soft, so Kendall is not hearing it. Atu spelt in those certain sorts of ways. So there's it's a great book to look at. In fact, it's accessible online. It's beautifully digitised, and you can look through the whole thing if you just Google Kendall and Kōrero Nor New Zealand, and you'll find it because it's been digitised by the Auckland Museum, and it's a beautiful book, and it shows you, and it just indicates a lot about conversations that people were having at the time, how Māori language was being transcribed and what the Pākehā ear could hear. Now, now I'm changing tack a little bit because while Tuai was in Australia, he decided, and with the permission of his brother, Kōrokoro, who was a powerful rangatira from Ngare Raumati, he decided he wanted to go to England. And one of the reasons he wanted to go to England was, as I said before, to try and find settlers for his part of the bay, because by now we're up to about 1813, 1814, 1815. Remember, the first Pākehā settlers came here in 1814, and they were in the rival territories of Tuai, because they were in the northern Bay of Islands. The next lot came in 1819, or it was a bit after this. They came into Kerikeri, but already Pākehā had settled for the first time in this part of the world, but they were in territory and strengthening the arm of Ngāpuhi-aligned hapu. So Korokoro, who could see the writing on the wall, was very keen for his younger brother to travel to England and try and find settlers to come to his part of the world. So Tuai and his mate Titere asked Marsden if he would support them to travel to England, and he agreed. He wasn't that reluctant. He was a bit reluctant because so few Māori, a very small handful of Māori, had been to England and come back to tell the story. Because if you set off on a boat in those days over the horizon, the likelihood that you'll come back alive or at all was very slight, because of the diseases that you would encounter, particularly as you go up through Indonesia, because that was the way the ships went up across, the top of Australia, through Indonesia, down around, and you'd get yellow fever and smallpox and all sorts of things. But he also was very, very keen that Tuai did go to England, because he thought Tuai would become the great proselytiser. And if he went to England and was trained by the Church Missionary Society in London and looked after in England, he would work up a debt to the Church Missionary Society. Marsden knew about Māori notions of debt, if you like, to balance that the debt that would be set up in Tuai and Titere would be such that they would come home and have to kind of repay by proselytising. But so Tuai and Titere set off to England. Very interesting voyage that they went on, and I managed to find a diary of a man who was on the ship that was with them, that went to Australia. It was in 2 volumes, and unfortunately the second volume was so waterlogged you couldn't read a word. I was so sad. But the first diary was fascinating, about them travelling up the east coast of Australia, and how Tuai and Titere were very interested in the Indigenous people of Australia, and who were very shy. So Titere decided one day to go and catch an Aboriginal person so he could sort of meet him. And so there's lots of interesting stories about that, and Tuai actually gave a bit of pounamu from his ear to an Aboriginal person, group of people in the very far north of Australia. So somewhere in the far north of Australia is Tuai's pounamu that was given. And so there's a whole interesting relationship we don't know very much about, the relationship between Māori and the Indigenous people of Australia. Anyway, I could go on. They did safely arrive in England, and it was winter. Immediately they got ill, and the Church Missionary Society that was hosting them was absolutely petrified they were going to die before they could send them back home. And so what they decided to do was to get them out of London as soon as possible. London in those days, as you probably also know, was pretty dire, very polluted, and full of diseases and people living on the streets, and really not a good place to survive if you're not immune to British or English European diseases. And so they sent Tuai and Titeri to live in the country in Shropshire. Is anyone here from Shropshire? There's always somebody from Shropshire, yeah. So they sent the two men to Shropshire to live in this house here that still exists. And we recently, a group of us from the north, went to follow in Tuai's footsteps. There's a rokata there just by the front door. And they stayed in this vicarage here. You can imagine coming from the Bay of Islands in 1818 to live in this place here. That place still exists, and I was fascinated by it because when I went up close to it, I noticed that most of the windows on the front, except one, are just painted on. They're not real windows, because that was to avoid the window tax, which was a form of property tax at the time. So it looks a bit flashier than it is. But we went inside. The owners of the house were very pleased to welcome us and showed us the actual bedroom that Tuai and or bedrooms that Tuai and Titeri would have actually stayed in while they were in Shropshire. Now they were this Madeley, which is now called Telford. It's part of a huge city. Is just on the edge of the Iron Bridge Gorge, and which of course, that's the church next door, where they went to church every Sunday compulsorily. Yeah, that, I don't know why I even showed you that, because that's one of those churches that's changed so much over the time. I don't think that was what it looked like when Titi was there. I put this picture up because I found it quite interesting when I was researching the Iron Bridge Gorge, which Madeley's right just on the top of the hill, and then you go down into this gorge by the Severn River, where the Industrial Revolution was going gangbusters at this time, or was petering out slightly actually. But there's this painting from 1815 which showed that there was a lot of anxiety amongst people about the impact, the pollution caused by the Industrial Revolution in this part of Britain. And they sort of had these diabolical landscapes that were both awesome, you know, in terms of the awe of this industry, but appalled by the degradation of human beings that were having to live with it. And this is the environment, I mean that's a caricature really, but this is the environment into which Tuai and Titeri were thrown. And they visited the factories regularly down in the valley. And they were very interested, of course, fascinated. And Tuai wrote in a letter, which I'll talk about in a minute, I see the iron run down like water. So he's watching the iron being smelted and made into big pots, you know, the big smelting pot, the pots that lay the tripods for the whalers, and seeing this really at the ceramics factories, all these factories that are in this huge valley. So he was actually witnessing this burst of technological change and productivity. So you can imagine his mind must have been completely blown, as well as feeling quite anxious about what all this meant for his people. Now, while he was in Madeley, he was pretty sickly the whole time. But while he was there, he obviously was thinking very much about home and about his brother, Korokoro, and he drew this picture of Korokoro's face. That's his writing, Thomas Tuai, Korokoro. He was learning to write, and that is a drawing that he did of his brother's face, which I think is absolutely beautiful and extremely poignant, because he did not know whether he would ever get to see his brother again. So he was bringing his brother to him, and so he rendered his face on paper like that. That drawing lives in the Cadbury collection in Manchester. Now, the hosts of Tuai and Titeri wanted to get them to leave the country as soon as possible because they were terrified they were going to die, but they needed to convert them to Christianity before they came back so that their journey was worth it. And so poor old Tuai and Titeri had to do daily lessons on the Bible and scriptures, which they actively disliked. But they were rewarded with all kinds of other things, like they were given a man shed, a shed, a box of tools, and etc., etc. So got lots of things to do that they enjoyed. But they were under a program, basically, which was to try and change the Māori cultural ways. And so this is an interesting letter here. There are about 14 letters that are written by Tuai and Titeri that exist, and they're in the Hocken Library. Very interesting documents. And you can see this one here, that's actually Titeri's handwriting. What's interesting about the letter is that, about the writing of the letter, is that Tuai and Titeri couldn't really write. They were being taught, but as Marsden said, they're far too old to be taught to write. They were around about 19 or 20, so they were considered far too old, and they considered themselves far too old to be learning to read and write. And so basically they spoke their letters, they spoke what they wanted. Their English was very good by the stage, and one of their companions wrote down their letter, and then they copied that written work onto paper. So this is actually Titeri's hand writing his own words via an amanuensis. So it's actually a beautiful bit of a beautiful document. I just thought I'd show you this because this is what the pressure Titeri and Tuai were under. In this letter here, New Zealand God, he saying, I'm sorry I go away and leave you behind, because by this stage they were now going back to New Zealand finally. Thank goodness, said the Church Missionary Society. When I get home to my own country, I remember you and all kind friends in England. And I tell my countrymen how Englishmen pray for New Zealand man. Hope New Zealand man read God's book and hear missionary talk about Jesus Christ our Saviour. He will then leave off eating man's flesh. Hope too New Zealand woman no hang herself when her husband he died, but marry again in 2 or 3 years. New Zealand God no true. This is the bit that really gets me. New Zealand God no true, all nonsense. Englishman God and Englishman's Bible all true. Hope the New Zealand Bible make New Zealand man leave off the tapu and like the English way. Oh, how kind Englishman to New Zealand man. He pray for me. He send missionary to my sister country to talk about Jesus Christ. So this is the kind of quite intense pressure that Tuai and Titeri are under to be grateful to the English for coming to save Māori. And it's fascinating to read these passages and to think about what happened subsequently. Because what happened, this is a little bit this is also a place. When we went on our little tour around England, we went to all the places Tuai and Titeri went, and they also stayed in this place when they had to move out of the vicarage for a few days while the woman of the house was having a baby. They stayed in this amazing place. Because the owner of this place was a member of the Church Missionary Society and welcomed them. And the same family still own that house. And this room is unchanged from the time when Tuai was there. So he would have actually seen those chairs, those paintings and everything. I mean, obviously the electric light is a new innovation. But there we are staring at the things that Tuai would have stared at. Okay, so what happened? Well, when Tuai and Titiri got back to London, ready to go to back to New Zealand, Tuai had his portrait done in a silhouette, which I just absolutely love. He signed it himself, but you can really see his face there. He had his hair done in the style of the young men of the day, where they had this top knot, which is a little bit like today, some people, and tied up on the top. But that's an absolutely beautiful silhouette of him. While he again was ill in London, so Titiri went to the Tower of London, and he wrote in his letter, "I see 1,000 guns, no one give me one at all." He was incredibly, could not work out why they had actually thousands and thousands of guns in England and they wouldn't even spare one for him. But Tuai and Titiri were becoming incredibly aware of British power, British military power. Visiting the Tower of London, you can't help. And that's what it was before, really, to all people. Because everything, all the guns, the bayonets, the cannons are all arranged in decorative order. They're not just stacked in boxes, they're all arranged for people to see. Also, while Tuai and Titiri were in London, just before they left, Tuai started to become very, very ill, and this is where the Christian story becomes interesting. As he was becoming ill, he was drawing pictures, and these are two that he drew in 1818 of waka, and there is no record of conversation about these drawings, but it's quite possible that these are Puna who are coming to save Tuai, to take him back, should he die in his illness. But they're the most beautiful, the earliest Māori drawings on paper that still exist. This one is particularly beautiful. Another waka done in detail. I'm just about getting to the crisis of the story. On the way back to New Zealand, the ship got becalmed and also banged into a sandbank and had to be repaired. So they had to hop off the ship in Kent and Brompton. They stayed in the second house along, which looked exactly like that at the time, in that dim-looking place there. And Tuai was going to die there. He believed he was going to die there because he had bronchitis. He was getting worse and worse and worse. And the missionaries who were with him were saying, "You must believe in Jesus. You must believe in Jesus. Jesus will save you." And Tuai, as we know, Māori thought, we're coming to the conclusion, and Tuai had come to the conclusion that this was a Pākehā disease. He needed Pākehā help. He needed Pākehā spiritual help. And the missionaries emphasised that this was the case. And so one night he said, "Yes, I believe in Jesus Christ." And that night he had a terrible dream in this house here. And his father and his dead father and his dead brother appeared to him and said, "For why you pray to Jesus Christ?" And he said, "It makes me happy." And they hid their faces and went away sorrowful. So this was part of Tuai's crisis as he was coming back to New Zealand. On the ship, he actually did get better. And the missionary companions said, "You see, this is Jesus saving you." As close as when he came closer to New Zealand, he realised that it wasn't going to be something he could do. And he basically had a nervous breakdown on board that ship. And he stayed in his cabin weeping for hours and hours. And the missionaries with him, they were actually the next lot that were coming out to Kerikeri, Kemp and Co., were very, very alarmed at his state of mind. and he decided after this crisis that he wasn't going to believe in Jesus Christ after all. He couldn't. He was coming back to his brother Korokoro. He was coming back to a Māori world. He was part of the Māori world. And to think that he could come back and say to his brother, I've been to England, I brought back settlers, and now I believe in Jesus Christ, his brother would have thought he'd gone completely crackers, apart from the first part, which, getting the settlers was what he wanted. But unfortunately, when those second settlers came, and what were the other ones from Kirikiri? Sorry? No, Williams is later. Kirikiri. There's Kemp and, anyway, someone will know. When they arrived in New Zealand with Tuai, and Marsden came over to New Zealand with them. Hongihika arrived. When the ship arrived, Hongihika turned up in the Bay of Islands, Korokoro turned up, the two rangatira turned up. Hongi said to Marsden, you can have any land you like up the Kirikiri. Marsden went up there and had a look at that area where the stone store is now and said, yep, this will do me, we'll go for this. Korokoro said, I'll give you any land you want over our side. Marsden reluctantly went over there, had a look, said, nah, maybe not. Korokoro was absolutely furious. He had sent his brother over to England, his brother had almost died, come back with these Pākehā, and they treated him like that. So now the power was really in the hands of Ngāpuhi, and there was nobody with Ngare Raumati. So Tuai returned to Ngare Raumati. This was the time he advised Hongihika, his rival, Hongihika spoke to Tuai about England, about the Tower of London, about the king. Tuai couldn't get to see the king who was indisposed. Remember the George the Third? Yeah, who was constantly indisposed. So Tuai briefed Hongihika. So Hongihika immediately decided to go to England, and he went in 1820 and came back with all those guns, of course. The rest is history in terms of Hongihika's power. But Tuai returned to his people at Ngare Raumati. He got involved in when Hongihika got back from England in 1821 with all the guns, and went on those huge raids right down to Waikato, down to Rotorua, Hauraki, right round the coast. Tuai was amongst them, as was Korokoro, because it was a big alliance of the northern tribes against the others. Korokoro was killed during that time, and before he went on that expedition, Tuai got his full face tattooed, and here's a picture of him with his full face done. The missionaries were disgusted and disappointed and wrote him letters to tell him that he was a great disappointment to them, and he was very ungrateful. They had instructed him not to get his face finished, and he said, he visited the missionaries and said, I can't do anything else, I have to do this. It's part of who I am, and if I don't get it done, I'm considered to be effeminate and not a real fighting man. So he had his full face tattooed, and this is a beautiful drawing of Tuai. It was actually drawn not long before he died, in 1824 by French visitors on the ship La Coquille that came into the Bay of Islands in 1824. Aboard there was an artist, Jules-Louis Lejeune, who drew this beautiful portrait of Tuai, and you can see he used to wear European clothing. He came back with a stash of European clothing, and he wore it all times. And this is a very strange and interesting picture of Hongihika, Tuai with his coat on and his bayonet and his gun, and Te Rangi, who was Tuai's disabled brother. Very interesting picture, which could do with quite a bit of analysis. in terms of the way that it's posed and the relationship between these three men. I just want to come to a close. And this is another picture by Jules Louis Lejeune. And you may not be able to see very clearly, but this is in the background is Kahuwera Pa on the Pāroa Peninsula there, which is the, and you can see all the little whare on the sides of the hill, and here is Tuai. So he's the man about town, with his pipe and his hat and his outfit. He was doing pretty well, and he actually ran a very profitable prostitution business for a while in relation to the French. But he was very interesting with the French. He really took them on the social studies tours almost of his area and spoke to them about his people and his beliefs and Māori philosophy. So we learn a lot about that time from Tuai. He was not interested in fighting, he said. He was interested in having, conversation. And he spent 10 days on this French ship speaking about his life. And the French recorded it in French, and that has been translated into English, which is why we know so much about him. So that year, 1824, Tuai died. We don't know what he died of, and his wife and their small child the wife killed herself and the small child following his death, which was not uncommon at that time. And so Tuai disappears from view. Oopsie, that was weird. Literally and figuratively. And the last slide is this one taken from 1827. And the French, who had so enjoyed being with Tuai in 1824, came back in 1827 expecting to see Tuai and all the people, the Ngare Raumati people at Kahuwera, and they found the silent Pa. By now, as a result of, no doubt, the history we've just talked about, Ngāpuhi now had come through the area and chased the people off the land. The Ngare Raumati people got dispersed. So this was a Pa that was deserted in 1827, and the French wrote sadly about Tuai not being there, Korokoro not being there, and the land being quiet. So that's a kind of version of Tuai's story, which I tell in a lot more detail, obviously, in the book, Tuai, A Traveller in Two Worlds. Some of you might want to read that in more detail, I hope you do. Got sort of 3 or 4 minutes for questions, if anyone's got any questions.
Where do you get the French account of Tuai? Which is, what's that in?
It's there's a book that was published by the Alexander Turnbull Library in the 1960s that has got the French, the journals of the officers that were on board La Coquille at this particular time. They were translated into English by Isabelle Olivier. I am at this moment negotiating with the Alexander Turnbull Library to get them digitised because they are not available easily. You can find them in old bookshops, rare books sometimes, but they're not, they're basically in a museum. But once they're digitised, which we're working on at the moment, they will become available and you'll be able to read them in French and in English. And they tell a lot of really detailed stories about Tuai and his people.
How did he communicate with the French?
He communicated with the French in English. The French officers on La Coquille were scientists. They were bilingual, and so he communicated in English as far as we know from just looking at the diaries and things. What was interesting, people say, how did Māori communicate with Pākehā, or how did Pākehā communicate with Māori in these early times? And what's interesting is that the missionaries often wrote in their diaries. It was a great thing about missionaries. They wrote everything down because they had to account for every day to get paid. and they had to talk about who they spoke to and what they talked about in order to get paid. So we have brilliant records. But they said that they were really astonished and interested at how quickly Māori picked up English. Of course, I guess, if you're an oral culture, your ability to hear, retain and speak back is highly attuned, and so Māori learnt English off the ships and then teaching each other. When the children went to schools, like that first school, the children would go back to their villages, and then Pākehā would go into villages where they had, missionaries would go into villages where they had never been before, and kāinga where they'd never been before, and people would be reading. Because the children had gone to teach the people, and they were so interested in this technology. So this intense curiosity, high intelligence, was really evident during this time all around the north, and the missionaries wrote about it quite a lot in their diaries.
Tuai had trouble trying to tell his people about what he saw in England, especially like the industrial side of it, you know, to make them believe that it was true.
Yeah, well, he did, yes. Speaking to Hongi Hika, and then Hongi Hika going to England and coming back and talking about it, you can imagine everybody would have, because they would have been very interested, how do you make these things? And he'd actually seen them being made. Now, Hongi Hika, who went to England in 1820, he actually wanted to get miners. One of the things he went to England, he had a little list of the Pākehā he wanted to bring back for his people, and he had spoken to Tuai, and he wanted miners. He wanted to bring miners back from England to New Zealand to find iron and to start an iron industry here. So that's another glimpse that we get of Māori in this very early period in the north, bringing wheat back, wanting to bring iron here, find iron here, really wanting to engage in these technologies as part of the Māori world, so that as hapu, as rangatira, as iwi, they could then deal in that world, be part of that world as players. And that comes through often in these sorts of stories. And then the kind of refusal of Pākehā colonisers, or Pākehā imperialists, or Pākehā traders and travellers to kind of allow, engage with this desire of Māori to be part of this world. And that's where you get the kind of complete tragedy of the situation around about this period, where Māori were not enabled, in fact often stopped from this sort of industrial development, if you want to call it that, that was so, in which they were so interested and desired to be part of. Yeah. Yes, at the back.
So what happened to the iwi that were chased off this path? What happened to those people? Were they dispersed?
Yeah. Those people were dispersed down the coast, down the east coast, over to Waitangi, and Ngare Raumati people still whakapapa to Ngare Raumati, and there's a real renaissance of Ngare Raumati people and their stories, helped by this kind of work. But certainly it's the old story. The victors tell the history, don't they? The victors' stories. And so the Ngāpuhi stories of that area are the ones that are most often understood and heard, and the Ngāpuhi whakapapas, etc. So yeah, it's a complicated question, but Ngare Raumati people still exist, live, and still, like Te Rāwhiti and other places, there are still people, Ngare Raumati people there. But at that time, in 1826-27, they were just driven off that land.
Do they have a marae?
There are two marae in the area. Yeah, there's one in Kororarika and there's one in Te Rāwhiti. Yeah, that I know of. But it's not like you can say, well, I'm just Ngare Raumati, because there was lots of, obviously, intermarriage and everything changes, so people become Ngāpuhi as well. So it's not just you know, you're one thing or the other. It's a very complex history. Yes.
Aparo is near where Marion Dufresne would have also
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And was there any memory that Tuai kind of revealed to the French or anyone else about that time?
Yes, there was conversation about that, and that's in those diaries as well. Yeah. Yeah, the different stories about how come Marion Dufresne was killed, who was responsible, who was there, who wasn't there. And there was a lot of suspicion towards the French in the Bay of Islands, for sure. And there was a lot of suspicion about their muskets, because the French, who knew, the French had different muskets from the British. They looked different. And so there was a lot of discussion amongst Māori about whether British or French muskets were better.
Alison, we don't know where they're buried.
No. No, we don't know anything about what Tuai died of or where his remains are. No. Yes.
The goal of getting settlers to populate these areas, was that ever fulfilled? Did that ever happen? Or?
Well, yes, Ngare did well. He got Rangi Haua, then he got Kiri, then he got Paihia with the Williamses. So yes, they did pretty well. So that was Ngāpuhi aligned people, yeah. But for other people, I mean, I think you've just got to see it within the context of the time. That kind of general, which we today would call a kind of racist attitude towards Māori beliefs and power, was that, well, I'm not going to come here and live under savages. I'm not going to, they asked me to come to their land, but it'll be under their conditions. I'm not going to do that, you know. So that's that kind of sense of superiority which you get with the Christian idea, that our God is the superior God, yours is all nonsense. So that sense automatically, I'm not going to listen to what you want, I'm going to tell you what you must have. So it's a similar kind of thing if you've got Māori saying, Hongihika or Korokoro saying, come to my area, live amongst my people. Pākehā aren't going to say, yeah, sure, I'll do that, because they're setting up their own setups, with their own power structures. And then we get to the treaty, of course. Whole other story. Anyway, I'm quite conscious of time.
Last question?
Yes, one last question.
Well, I was just going to say, sometimes, you know, Pākehā, like, for instance, Tapahi and people like that adopted Pākehā and married them into the family. And I know my wife's family, they adopted Pākehā who was a sealer because he could trade. So it worked both ways, actually. They sometimes people that didn't have much chance in Europeans in a European world would end up
Would
washing
become
up in
powerful.
New Zealand and become Māori, and gain power through those alliances. So, and Tapahi had George Bruce, for instance, who became his son-in-law, and in the case of some of my family members, they had a guy called James Coffey, who became a Pākehā as well, that aligned himself with Māori. So it was a bit more complex in some ways, I think.
That relationship between Māori and Pākehā, in terms of Pākehā, Māori wanting Pākehā to come and be part of the Māori world, is very clear from what we're reading, and that the expectation was that Pākehā coming into an area wouldn't just kind of set up their houses and set up fences around it, but actually would be part of the hapu. And in fact, Ngare offered his son to marry Marston's daughter. And of course Marston, you can imagine Marston had an apoplectic fit and immediately sent his daughter to England to find an appropriate gentleman. But that, you know, we can laugh at that, but that's the tragedy, really. That is the tragedy right there, that Marston wanted to have the relationship, but not really, you know, not on Māori terms. And so he kept his daughter for a proper man, you know, from England. But, you know, it's just that moment of real desire for Hongika to have this close whakapapa relationship with a powerful a Pākehā family, and that refusal. You know, these little moments are so huge in their import for our whole history. Anyway, we better stop, haven't we, because we're past 12 o'clock.
Thank you so much, Alison. I'd just like to say on behalf of all of us, what an awesome story you told. Your book was amazing, but you've cranked it up even more by giving it even a stronger voice, and I think we can hear Tuai's voice talking to us from that past, and it's a very special part of our richness of our history, and it also influences who we are today. So it's such a special story, so thank you so much. I've got a little
Oh,
thank
thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
If you'd like to make a scrum and head for Alison's book, now's the time to do it.
Sorry, it's so few. Okay, these ones